Chris White joins me this week to discuss FrankenStout, FrankenYeast, and blending yeast. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 312. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 312, and it's late October 2024. Chris White joins me this week to discuss FrankenStout, FrankenYeast, and blending yeast. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They recently launched an all-new experience called Craft Spirits and Distilling. If you make or love spirits, check out spiritsanddistilling.com for recipes, how-to videos, their Spirits and Distilling podcast, and much more. Again, that new site is spiritsanddistilling.com. And also BeerSmith Web, the online version of BeerSmith brewing software. BeerSmith the Web lets you design great beer recipes from your tablet or phone. Edit recipes on the go with access to the same full suite of recipe building tools as our desktop version. Try BeerSmith Web today by creating a free account at beersmithrecipes.com. And finally, a reminder to click that like and subscribe button on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or whatever platform you're on. Clicking those buttons is a great way to support the show. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome Chris White. Chris is president of White Labs, Inc., a top provider of brewing yeast worldwide, as well as 2015 winner of the AHA Governing Committee Award for a lifetime of achievement in brewing. He's also the author of the book Yeast, which is the ultimate reference for brewing yeast. Chris, it's great to have you back on the show. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be back on the show.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. It's been about a year since we had you on last. I think you've been pretty busy this last year, right?
Yes, that year's gone by fast. It feels like I was just planning for 2024, and now it's time to plan for 2025 and see what brewers and breweries and homebrewers want to do.
You've been up. Have you created some new yeast strains this year? New releases, perhaps?
Yeah, we did quite a few, and the Polish Grzyński strain. We've done different blends, Tripping Animals strain, and so we continue to work on new strains and working with breweries on what kind of innovation they want to do.
Awesome. And we were talking a little bit before the show. Unfortunately, I think you guys got hit in Asheville as well, right, with the big storm, the hurricane?
Yeah, the White Labs Asheville's right in the middle of downtown, the side of downtown, but not down the hill towards the Biltmore. The south slope really got destroyed. So from a building perspective, we did okay. We didn't have any flooding, but we didn't have power or water until just recently, and the water's still being worked on. So we're not making any yeast or brewing any beer or serving any food at the moment. But the most important thing was the people. They were all safe, and many of them were able to come back in and just do work in the dark as much as they could. It was amazing stories of what the staff did there to help other staff, to help the community, water giveaways, cooking food out in the parking lot, distributing supplies. So it was a huge effort, and some people couldn't get in, but because that's the problem with Asheville. So many of the housing is in the mountains and the hills, and even on a snowstorm, people are just locked in. So we're used to a couple-day snowstorm and things like that. That's why we kind of prepare for weather, but no one saw this coming.
Yeah, it was quite a massive storm, and I guess you've had to rejiggle production, and you mentioned you were helping out some of the local breweries as well.
Yeah, we're trying to help out the breweries. Some of the breweries are just completely wiped out. Their fermenters are floating down the river full of beer,
Wow.
and destroyed. And so that's just heartbreaking. And then the ones that are getting started up, we're trying to help with yeast as much as we can. Again, we had a pretty good water supply that we were able to help on some in the beginning. But at first we were thinking, okay, it'll be a few days. Everybody even there thought, this will just clear, but it was so destructive to the infrastructure of the city, to the community. Like the French Broad River just wrecked havoc on New Belgium Brewery and everything else in its way.
Wow. Awful. Well, today you wanted to talk a little bit about stouts and dark beer yeast, porter yeast, for example. And I know you're doing the return of FrankenStout and the return of your FrankenYeast. But I thought we'd start with a discussion of dark beers and dark beer yeast. What makes a good stout or porter yeast?
Well, it's a good start of the conversation because there'd be no FrankenStout if we didn't have a history and be interested in dark beers. And I think in my early homebrewing days, this is well before IPAs. It was dark beers, whether they were dark Belgian beers, maybe dark lagers, but that was always hard for homebrewers and small breweries at that time. But porters and stouts were the kind of the backbone of everybody's homebrewing and everybody's beer lineup. And they're just such interesting beers. And porters, there's different ones too, robust and so on. But in general, you're talking about a complex malt profile, fairly low hop levels usually, but there, and complexity, right? And that's where yeast comes in, because these beers, especially to say win medals, need to have the complexity that goes along to add the mouthfeel and everything. So, and that's where different yeasts can really, a lot of our early yeast selections, from English ale yeast to dry English ale yeast, not dry form, but just drier fermentation-wise, higher attenuation. And a lot of these early release strains were to help make beers of character, and obviously the stouts with the roasted character, and the secret, I think, from the fermentation side or for the brewers, how do you add mouthfeel without just sweetness? That's the easy part to do, but I like to have yeast add complexity and a perceived sweetness through fermentation characteristics without having an overly sweet beer. And an example of that back in the 90s was La Cruda Brewery in San Diego. And it was one of those early kind of downtown upstart craft breweries. And within months of opening, they won a gold medal at the Great American Beer Festival for their robust porter.
Wow. That's pretty cool.
How that beer tasted. So that La Cruda yeast, it was a private strain that we banked for this new brewery, is still being used by brewers in San Diego that have ties to the old La Cruda brewery. And that strain just added, so much interesting character to the beers that we actually, all these years later, just brewed a dry Irish stout at White Labs with WLP007, kind of one of our mainstays, dry English ale yeast for dark beers, porters and stouts, along with the La Cruda yeast, with permission, even though we bank it. It's just, it adds, some of the brewers just were talking about how it gives off chocolate notes, creamy, adding to the mouthfeel, and balanced flavors, with high attenuation. And that's sort of a key to winning medals, high attenuation.
Yeah. It is interesting. A lot of people think that, if you make a porter or stout, they really focus on the grain bill and not so much the yeast profile, but the yeast does contribute a lot of these characteristics. Can you talk about some of the character? You were talking about these yeasts have a particular character to them.
Yeah. We talk esters a lot, but you don't want to make them overly estery, right? Overly fruity. That's where that nuances of balance really come in. And so some yeast strains can add smokiness characteristics, and that's what we see when we make the blends that we'll talk about later. Earthiness, like I said, chocolate, some of the things you would just characterize with the malt, but the yeast are adding these 500 to 1,000 flavor and aroma compounds that come together to also taste like characteristics you just can't get from malt. We talk about fruitiness. There's nothing fruity in malt. There's a few fruity hops nowadays, but for esters, you always had to get that from yeast. But they also make a lot of other flavor and aroma compounds that add. That's why using yeast right, getting a good fermentation, getting the right speed of fermentation and yeast health and everything gives you the beers with the right balance, right complexity.
Mm-hmm. How is a stout or porter yeast different than maybe a typical English yeast that you might use for a mild or a bitter?
Well, you want a yeast that can work in that darker malt environment, and it might sound simple, but it's something we didn't know in the past. But it does. These darker beers have an effect on yeast fermentation performance. In fact, we used to propagate our yeast in kind of a darker malt material, but we found the vibe didn't last as long. So we brewers saw this about the same time when IPAs were becoming popular. People said, I can't repitch my yeast from an IPA. It's got all this hops in it, like we say about everything new, like now hazy or something else, because so we better go get the yeast from the ESB or the porter or something. We're thinking alcohol strength, not just malt color.
Sure.
But we found the color had an impact on viability, especially over time. And I remember Mitch Steele, when he was at Stone giving a talk at Craft Brewers Conference years ago, saying, hey, guys, you can use yeast from your IPA. I mean, it's obvious now, but and you know what? It's a better fermentation. Yeast seem to do better. So forget the hops part. That lighter West Coast malt bill and color without specialty malts leads to better yeast performance. So something you got to think about on the dark beer side and why you might see some sluggish fermentations or things like that. It's a little bit, who knows really what those adjunct malts and specialty malts, really specialty malts, are adding to inhibit the yeast. But they do.
Another character you mentioned was high attenuation, which I really haven't heard talked about much with associated with dark beers. But why is high attenuation actually important for a good porter or stout?
Because that leads to the drinkability part. Again, let the little things they make add the complexity. But and mouthfeel is important because you don't want a thin beer, but it can still be dry. It's the same thing with the Belgian style beers. Abbey kind of doubles and triples. In Belgium, they're super dry. 1 Plato sort of final gravity. Yeah. And then early on when brewers were making them in the States, they were just sweet because people thought they should be sweet. They tasted sweet, but they're not. That's the body and complexity and the esters that kind of can taste sweet. Same thing on the porters and stouts. I think you're really looking at attenuation is important. This dry stout that I mentioned we just made, in fact, we wanted it even drier. So we used Ultra Firm, which is the enzyme we have that aminoglycosidase for people think of it for light American lagers, but I think it can be used on lots of beers that you want drier and low carb.
And that's an enzyme that makes it ferment out more, right? I think right.
So Ultra Firm is our name, and we have it in both pro and homebrew sizes. So we added 125 mils to each of the 5-barrel fermenters. So that's about 5 mils per 5-gallon homebrew batch.
Sure.
And so you could add it in the mash, but we this one we added in the fermenter. You can add the fermenter as well. And, we got near zero final gravity, and it does not taste that way. It tastes very drinkable.
That's cool. Well, of course, I'm a big fan of dry Irish stouts. And that beer is even a little bit different than the typical English stout. How are the two yeast strains in the two beers slightly different?
Typically the English strains that we were releasing in the past were about less attenuation, and now then people were looking. That's why we came out with dry English. Over 20 years ago, but it was like a move towards still a little bit more attenuation, but full flavor. So, and then that's why we continue to release different blends and things like that we have today. But I would say, for example, the dry stout we just made with the WLP 007 and the private strain, which is WLP 5019. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you never see that in the catalog. But the Lacruda yeast, it is just, more complexity from more dark malt flavor, friendly flavors that this yeast make. And so you go back to like, gosh, why did that beer win a medal in the 1990s? Well, great brewers. Tommy Arthur was the assistant brewer there at the time, and he would go off to do a lot of great things. Obviously,
yeah, he did.
So, he's 2 months into a brewing gig, and they win a gold medal at the Great American Beer Festival. So you pair an interesting yeast strain with great brewers, and you can have some really awesome results.
Any other tips on selecting yeast for darker beers?
Well, it does come to some preferences. California ale yeast is a terrific yeast for stouts and porters. Clean, full fermentation, more malt forward yeast.
I would have guessed that, but I can see how that would work.
And, today we are seeing a lot of people use lager yeast.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's sort of not new, but sometimes things get recycled. Anchor Steam's porter back in the 90s was famous to be used. They used a lager yeast with it.
So are they fermenting the lager yeast at ale temperatures, or are they doing it at lager temperatures?
At ale temperatures. Sometimes with a little bit of pressure, but it's not mandatory to go to half or 1 bar, but that people do that. So that's kind of the buzzword right now, as using lager yeast for IPAs. Village Brewing Company, which is some brewers that came from Ballast Point that got a nice little brew pub down near Petco Baseball Stadium. They've been using WLP 920 Old Bavarian yeast. They just started using it in all their beers. And they have Baltic Porter. What's the name of that beer? Harbor Nights. It's just their latest batch 72. They put all their recipes online and talk about their yeast and everything like that. So I love when breweries do that. And so Baltic Porter at 9.8% alcohol with Old Bavarian. And they had found in their Ballast Point days that yeast was just great on everything. And adding the complexity, being able to go 20, 30 generations. And their final gravity on that one was 7. They put on the recipe. So not everything has to be super attenuative. I don't know where it started, but pretty high to be 9.8% alcohol with a final gravity of 7 Plato.
I would think so. Yeah, I would think that's pretty high.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what we're seeing too. We are seeing people trying to make, say porters, for example, typically 4.5, 6.5, 7%. That's what they were. But people are pushing these alcohols up. So it's like low alcohol is popular, or non-alcohol, and high alcohol are selling well.
Huh. Interesting. Well, for Halloween, you re-released your legendary WLP 096 FrankenYeast blend, which is a blend of something like 96 strains, along with a cool video. Can you tell us a little bit about the yeast first?
Well, it's a funny story. Back in 2013, we started a DNA sequencing project on 96 yeast strains with local company Illumina, which has become very massive and hired some of our people, which is cool. It's competitive to have a lab person in San Diego. They must love beer to work at White Labs, because we've got a lot of biotech companies around here. And Illumina has done great. And so they wanted to showcase their high throughput DNA sequencing machines in kind of a fun beer project. So some local people also participated from the community, homebrewing and so on. And 96 is interesting because a lot of people in science would know the joke, but their sequencing machine uses a 96 well plate.
Mm-hmm.
and you put the yeast DNA in there, and you put it in their machine, and lo and behold, long time later, it's the same idea. With their machines are used for the human sequencing like you would do with 23andMe and so on. Mm-hmm. But it hadn't been done with brewer's yeast yet. So it turned into 157 yeast strains once we kind of partnered with Kevin Verstreppen's lab in Belgium, who was also wanting to do it. So they kind of led the project from there, but we published that paper in Cell in 2016 on 157 yeast strains. But between 2013 and 2016, when the DNA sequencing on all these brewer's yeast was done, we said, and we started White Labs Brewing Company in 2012. We said, gosh, we should make a beer with those 96 yeast strains and call it FrankenStout and make it 9.6% alcohol. So that's what we did. And we then we made it, and the idea was we were going to repitch the yeast, save the samples, see how the population changed. Well, that sort of broke down over time because we couldn't make it that often. It takes a long time to sell a stout. We were making 10 to 20 barrels at a time and selling it in one little tap room here in San Diego.
Yeah.
So then it helped when we opened up in Asheville. We got a bigger restaurant out there, and so we had more, places to sell this FrankenStout. But the funny thing is, it got kind of a cult following. And we sort of didn't make it enough. And I was sitting downstairs in our tap room, earlier this year, and I was noticing people were calling, hey, do you have FrankenStout on? Somebody would come in, and over time, over the few week period, hey, do you have FrankenStout? And we're like, no, we don't have it on right now. So, you just listen to customers. I'm like, well, let's make it again. You only have to make it a few times a year to have it on all year long. So we just decided, hey, we're going to get this going again. We're going to make FrankenStout. It makes so much sense for White Labs. All these yeast strains, all in one beer. And we were going to do a big Frankenbash party for Halloween this weekend in Asheville. We made a whole bunch of beer. We canned some beer. And unfortunately, with what happened in Asheville, that is not going to happen. So we'll see what we can do with it for charity and so on. But we got a lot of it right now. In fact, yesterday, there was a person in our tap room drinking it, a regular of ours, and I'm drinking the FrankenStout because I know it's not going to last. And I won't see it again for a while. I said, calm down. Okay, we made a bunch. We'll make some more.
So you also did a video along with this. Can you tell us about the video?
Yeah, it was really a brainchild of not mine. It was James that works here, and he's into a lot of videography, and he does a lot of our marketing. We have two guys, James here in San Diego and Todd in Asheville, and they kind of do different things. But he had this vision of making a little sort of movie clip. And I thought, gosh, okay. So he said, well, here's the budget I need. I need to go buy stuff. I'm like, well, we have a lab full of stuff. He said, no, I need this, and I need this. I need a little smoke, and I need some. So I'm like, okay, well, go ahead. So like a month later, he said, okay, let's film it. And we started in the afternoon. At midnight, I was still here.
It takes a lot of time to film stuff, doesn't it?
I was flying to Copenhagen the next day for our 10-year celebration out there of the lab. So I come back, and it's all done, and it came out pretty funny. Like, I don't know how he clipped. I'm not an actor, so he clipped it together pretty good into a few minutes, and it's on our website and social media, and it's just a little fun. Their take on what FrankenStout meant to some of our staff.
Yeah, I watched it. It was a pretty funny video, so I recommend people watch it. It's on YouTube as well, obviously.
Oh, okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about the beer itself? What does it taste like when you take 96 different yeasts and blend them together?
Well, I remember first tasting it in 2013 or 14 when we first made it. And you probably know when we first did it. I don't know. But anyway, I was just like, wow, this taught me something about yeast blends. I'd already been talking about yeast blends a little bit, but we were thinking 3, 4, 5 strains. But when you put these 96 yeast strains in there, first thing I thought is it tasted like it was aged in wood.
Interesting.
That was just from the microbiology. There's no Brett strains. It's all Saccharomyces strains. But Belgian style strains, wheat beer strains, all the ale strains, all the lager strains.
All the lager strains too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Fermented, at 20°C, so warm. 18, so 68 Fahrenheit. And super dry. No enzyme, no long mash. Just super dry because, again, all of these weird strains doing their thing. You get the attenuation of the most attenuative strains in a blend, and you get the flavor profile of everything. So it's a fight between phenolic and fruity. That's how I would describe FrankenStout.
Wow.
Every batch comes out a little different, and then we repitched it, and that one, actually the first batch we said, let's make it again. It went to 11%.
Wow.
So we said, we got to make it again because the cans say 9.6, right? We can change the draft, but you can't change the can we already printed. So we made another batch, and what was fun is we blended the blends. We blended the two batches to nail 9.6. But what's on tap in San Diego and soon to be Asheville when they reopen is the 11% version that we blended in to the other one. And I kind of like the 11.
Is the 11 better? Yeah.
This is better.
But that's quite high for a stout, I think.
It does not taste 11.
No? Interesting. Well, let's tie this back to some of the science. So you genotyped some 157 strains, right?
Yep.
And you blended 96 of those together here. What are some of the things you found when you started genotyping all the strains? How were they related, for example?
Well, it was pretty cool because they are related, and some strains like WP002 and WP007 are very similar, but they're genetically distinct, and that's what you see in what they do in fermentation. And so in things like California ale yeast, we put a few other versions into the sequencing, like from other companies and stuff like that, and they're different. And California ale yeast was unique and actually some interesting brewing properties like flocculation and attenuation. So that's why ours is a little different than, say, USO5 by Fermentus or some of the other liquid versions. But also just the fact that the strains that we're calling, California ale yeast or East Coast ale yeast had true genetic similarities to those regions from the other strains, meaning in these regions, they're changed by the brewers in those regions, and they're genetically distinct from the strains we're calling British ale yeast and Scottish ale yeast. Just like it was fascinating because sometimes you're like, is this true or not? Here's these yeast strains and yeast banks that we're collecting, sometimes from breweries, back in the 90s. But they really are that unique and distinctive to those regions, shown now by the DNA sequencing. Just like if you do your DNA sequencing, you'll see if you have English DNA in you, how much English,
Sure.
how much German, how much, and Americans tend to be mixes of all sorts of things, Chinese, African, Native American, all sorts of stuff, right? So, and that's what you see with the yeast strains. They're a little bit of mixes of lots of different thousands of years and especially hundreds of years of active brewing.
I saw the wheel chart.
Really
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
The evolutionary side of it, right? That's where my interest was. People thought when I was doing the sequencing, even I was getting the questions back then, oh, you're going to make something, And so FrankenStout's sort of a fun joke on that. We didn't really make anything. We just put them all together and made something unique. Now other people are using that DNA sequencing information, which is public, to make constructs and make fun things, GMO style or non-GMO style. But my interest was really understanding the yeast through a DNA Anybody that worked on that DNA, the White Labs people and the non-White Labs people could talk to you about our yeast from a DNA perspective that we sort of never brought into the catalog. But
I seem to remember you did a big wheel chart on that, right?
Yes.
And I remember they fit into a couple large groupings. Like some of them were related to bread yeast, I think, for example.
Right. So the wilder strains tend to be more similar to baking yeast, because at one point baking yeast was taken from brewer's yeast.
I would have guessed the other way around, but
no. Brewer's bread used to be made with brewer's yeast, because beer was made everywhere. And
I know you serve. If you go to Chris's restaurant, he serves pizza made with beer yeast, right?
Yeah. We use brewer's yeast in our pizza doughs and our breads and things because that's what used to be. Brewer's yeast is the best yeast. It makes the best flavors. The only reason people moved to baker's yeast through mating was it was faster. Distiller's yeast is faster. Okay, but you lose flavor. So try to make a beer. Maybe people have done it, right? Make a beer with baker's yeast, similar to some of the original dried yeast that was out there when I started homebrewing.
Yeah,
it tastes awful. Tasted awful. I mean,
yeah.
In bread, you have a short contact time. The phenols bake away. It doesn't taste that way. But in beer, all those flavors are going to be in your beer. There's no getting rid of them. There's no distilling them or baking or anything, right? So fermentation's all post-boil for brewing. So you have to have a great yeast. And that's why brewer's yeast, selected by brewers over time to do that, is the best yeast. So use it for bread. So what if it's slower?
Yeah.
Forget the recipe. Throw the recipe.
I assume that just means it rises a little slower, right?
Yeah. So that's why sourdough is a 3-day process.
Yeah, it is.
Because
I've done that before.
It's not baker's yeast.
Yeah.
So we do brewer's yeast in a sourdough process. And it's fascinating. That was a heavy debate back in the 1700s in France and stuff like that. When people started using brewer's yeast, there's all this literature of how people got mad in France. Oh, you can't use brewer's yeast. Must follow the sourdough process. But the brewer's yeast was faster.
Interesting.
In England, they were just using brewer's yeast. Forget it. That's best. Now, but we call it brewer's yeast and sourdough process because there is nothing else that is 3 days in liquid.
Cool. Well, I wanted to finish with a little bit of talk on hop blends. Yeast blends. Obviously, a lot of commercial brewers are now using hop blends now. And some of them are just starting to really experiment more with yeast blends. What are some of the challenges you run into when you start blending 2 or more yeasts together in a single beer?
I think the challenges are very, very limited. And it's what's kept people, I will talk about them, but it's kept people from doing it. But as people, and I've been talking about blends for a long time, then FrankenStout was a fun way to talk about blends, even though, we sell the FrankenYeast blend too. That's for sale right now. People can use the 96.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
Yeah. So, but it, to me, also should highlight blends in general. The 3, 4, 2 strains, whatever you want. We make other blends. And brewers are calling us about blends right now. It is one of the buzzwords. They're calling us about lager yeast in different beers, as I mentioned. They're calling us about high pressure, so they don't have to pitch as much yeast to do cold temperature fermentations, save some money. They're calling us about blends. So it's making the buzz. And because it's also a way to add complexity in any beer. Because the attenuation, as I said, is going to be the most attenuative of the mix. The flavors are going to be additive. And here's why the challenges are not that big of a deal. There's no kill factor in brewer's yeast. They've been by themselves for so long. They don't fight. Pure culture started in 1883. We're almost to the birthday of that, November 11th, 1883. Mm-hmm. In Emil Christiansen lab, close to our White Labs Copenhagen. So we can just feel that history. In fact, they just had a meeting in his old lab recently.
Wow.
So that pure culture started pure culture, and everything's pure culture. Great. That White Labs Pure Brewer's Yeast was the start of the company name, and the pure was meaning single strains, not the microbiology purity you think of that we try to achieve too, but pure in brewing terminology means one strain. But blends have a good reason for comeback because we can make them all aseptically, put them together, right? So
Right.
then you get this consistency is the key thing of brewing. Why I went to pure culture, but blends are really, really consistent. We've done a lot of studies over the years where we blended these together and we looked at the population changing as well as you can do. And we would see changes in the population, but very little change in the flavor characteristics of the beer because you still have millions of cells per mil of each of these blends, even though the proportion might start at 50-50 and go 30-70 for as best as you can measure. But the sensory panels aren't seeing a difference. Because, again, you've got so many of those cells doing that flavor distribution, doing that attenuation, and repitching even 10 times, 5-10 times. That population, it would take 100 repitches to really get a difference in, say, that culture stayed pure. Lab-wise, we found it took about 100 generations to really start noticing sensory differences.
Wow, that's amazing. Now you talked about attenuation. One yeast is typically going to dominate. The larger one's going to dominate the attenuation. But the other yeast characteristics, do they tend to blend together? Do they tend to does one characteristic tend to dominate another, or do you get a true mix in the finished blend?
You get a true mix. Now you add phenolic positive strains. Those could be described as Belgian-style strains or wheat beer strains, but really it's POF positive, phenolic off flavor positive. That's the brewing term, lab term. That's a pretty dominant flavor. Mm-hmm. That's why everybody's scared of wild yeast, because all wild yeast make phenols. And it just makes everything taste like a Belgian beer.
So you can't hide that one, right?
Right. So that's why a lot of the yeast harvesting, hey, let me go get some cool yeast out of some insects in my backyard or on flowers. It's good. It's interesting if it ferments and makes alcohol. If it makes alcohol, you can consider it safe, but it's going to taste phenolic. And most people would just say, oh, it tastes like a Belgian because it's kind of a dominant flavor characteristic in a Belgian yeast.
But the other characteristics, they tend to blend together pretty well?
Yes. I would say it's best to blend non-phenolic strains together, ale strains. You could throw a lager strain in there too, or the Belgian-style strains. You get more complexity in the phenolic profiles. Especially, say you're trying to make some beyond beer things. You're trying to make some cider, seltzers. Using phenolic strains is kind of fun. Belgian-style strains, they work great. And again, you don't notice that phenol in non-malted barley malt products. So
really,
we made a blend recently we were originally making it for seltzers, and it's called WP 101 Supercell. Just kind of throwing that out and seeing what people think. And it's a blend. It's not as big a blend as FrankenStout, but it's a big blend. And it turned out that it made awesome ciders, better than our single strain English cider yeast.
I'll be darned.
It makes again the seltzer part work, but it's also made great pizza doughs in the kitchen. It made really interesting distilled products. So we have a bunch of people using it for bourbons, and most people making vodkas and gins are just buying grain neutral spirit, but people making rums and bourbons and other whiskeys are a lot of times getting yeast cultures from us. So this Supercell works great in that too. For just more complexity, it's a blend that has higher complexity.
And I should mention, you do sell a number of pre-blended yeasts, right?
Yeah. Cream ale yeast blend is. I just looked at my poster.
That's okay. You got your big poster there.
I got my poster. Doesn't every brewer, home brewer, have this poster?
I think so, yeah.
So I just I keep it right here, and I just set it here. And I can look at it immediately. Coastal Haze blend. So when we started working with hazies, we have the blockbuster one, the WP 66 London Fog. But people wanted something different. So what you can do, you can blend some high thiol strains in there that you wouldn't normally use. So we have Coastal Ale Yeast blend that also has some lemon fog. Tropical blend, more thiols. Cream ale blend, like I said, to get some lager ale characteristics in a cream ale. And Belgian style ale yeast blend is one we still make. So I mean, the menu of blends is just limited by your imagination.
It's infinite, yeah.
Yeah.
Is there somewhere people can learn a little bit more about blending yeast? I don't know if you guys have anything on your website or.
Good question.
I know you have information on the blends that you sell, right?
Yes, we have information on the blends we sell. We have information on the DNA sequencing project if you want to pick yeast based on the DNA information. We have
Is there whitelabs.com, I assume?
whitelabs.com and the blog section and resources, I believe. We're posting so much of that stuff on YouTube now these days and our own social media. Pretty sure.
I wanted to mention the FrankenStout video, of course, is on YouTube as well.
Oh, yes. Yeah, and we have that on our whitelabs.com site. White Labs Brewing Co. site, it's whitelabsbrewingco.com.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, we made a different site. But anyway, that's where all our recipes live. So
That's
you want
cool.
the recipe for FrankenStout? It's on there. You want the recipe for our dry stout we just made? It's on there. We have porters, stouts made with 2 different yeast strains. So we have done so many dark beers, and they're always split among 2 different yeast strains. So you can go through that whole menu and see what yeast we chose and how they're different.
Yeah, and I know Asheville's down at the moment, but for those of you that haven't visited one of Chris's breweries, they do serve a lot of beers that are made with the exact same malt bill, but different yeasts, and it's very interesting to line them up and taste them side by side. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. It's super fun. We're hoping to get Asheville up again next week. Kind of what everybody's doing in that city is sort of a phase 1 plan, a phase 2, like, okay, who can come back to work?
2 main sites here, Asheville, of course, and San Diego, right?
Right. Yeah, San Diego.
Miramar, right? I think it is.
Miramar, yep.
Yeah. And then, I don't know, do you have a brewery in Copenhagen? I have never been there.
Yes. Yeah, we have a brewery in Copenhagen. So all 3 production facilities are breweries. Copenhagen doesn't have a retail outlet to sell the beer in, so we can the beer there.
Okay, so you don't have a tasting room, for example.
No.
Yeah.
No, but
like
when I was there, I mentioned a few weeks ago, for our 10-year Copenhagen party, they had just made an IPA, a West Coast style IPA, and
nice.
London Fog and another strain. So had cool little 4. So when we do can, we have 4-packs, 2 cans of one strain, 2 cans of the other strain. Our mobile canner that comes just loves us for that.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I mentioned I went to Prague and throughout Central Europe recently, and I was surprised they have an active craft beer industry growing there. It's not anywhere near as large as ours, but still a lot of passionate people making interesting beers.
That's craft, isn't it?
That's great, yeah. Well, Chris, I wanted to get your closing thoughts on any of the topics we discussed.
Yeah, we didn't really get into the fermentation tips too much. There's a whole handful of yeast you can use. Always ferment them the best you can. We got so many resources on that, and the whole brewing industry is pushed to learn more and more about what's the best pitching rate. What's the best zinc level. So now we have Zinc Buddy for that to help people on the cold side. Like I said,
you've been helping me, and I appreciate it for the next
cool.
version of BeerSmith and adding more pitch rate controls and so on into the yeast calculators. So thank you for that, Chris.
Yeah, I've worked so much. It was felt like I was writing the yeast book all over again, just building a darn calculator.
That's
how much
cool.
that is, right? But to do, and so, but it was a lot of fun because we added calculations to go many different ways. We had a repitch calculator we took off at the time just to get it back in format. We'll put that back on our site.
Mm-hmm.
But because more and more people are not starting repitching in commercial brewing these days. It used to be everybody, day one, here's how you repitch. But a lot of people are not starting that way these days. And now they're asking, so it's like they now want to learn something that used to come with the job. And so, we got to add more resources on repitching. And because it's a big believer in it, because yeast need to keep going. They're expensive to make, all these different strains in small batches, and even dry yeast, right? If you have the right dry yeast, we have 3 strains that could be repitched. Anyway, various levels of the calculator, like taking all the gravities into account, all the temperatures, all the things. And White Labs yeast has super high viability over time. And that's what's different, that I think we're working with you on your calculator, because our model doesn't work with other people. That's why we have went to a patented, got 2 patents on our yeast.
Yeah, I mean, I think we discussed it before. You use a pharmaceutical type style system to package it, which gives it very, very high purity and good viability.
Yeah. So you can use White Labs yeast for a long, long time. Yeah.
Well, Chris, thanks again for coming on the show. Really appreciate you being here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. I look forward to the next time we talk and do one of these.
Today, my guest is my good friend, Dr. Chris White, president of White Labs and author of the book Yeast from Brewers Publications. Chris, thank you once again for coming.
Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure. Yep, as I said, thank you.
A big thank you to Chris White for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They've recently launched an all-new experience called Craft Spirits and Distilling. If you make or love spirits, check out spiritsanddistilling.com for recipes, how-to videos, their Spirits and Distilling podcast, and much more. Again, that new site is spiritsanddistilling.com. And also BeerSmith Web, the online version of BeerSmith brewing software. BeerSmith for the web lets you design great beer recipes from any browser, including your tablet or phone. Edit recipes on the go with access to the same full suite of recipe building tools as our desktop version. Try BeerSmith Web today by creating a free account at beersmithrecipes.com. And finally, a reminder to click that like and subscribe button on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. Clicking those buttons is a great way to support the show. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.